welcome everyone to the first of our lunchtime events for a long time. And I'm delighted to say a very topical event given the UNGA going on in New York and the recent furore over the UK, Australia, shenanigans and submarines. The event is partly a standalone event, partly it's here to launch a new report on external perspectives on global Britain that you can find on our website today, and I recommend that to you most strongly. I'm delighted to welcome as our panelists here today, Dr. David Roberts, who collaborated with us in putting this report together. I hope you found the process as smooth as we did, David. Very much enjoyed it. I'm very pleased with the outcome. We have Gesine Weber, also from King's College, who authored the French chapter. I should say, on behalf of all authors, that they were not only asked to get us final versions before the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, but also clearly before the events of this week and last. But Gesine will be able to address those in comments. And particularly delighted to have with us David Lidington, former Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. We've just established he was our longest ever serving Minister for Europe. And I don't know if you remember this, David, but almost exactly 5 years ago, you came to the formal launch, 6 years ago actually, you came to the formal launch event for UK in a Changing Europe, which was at Duchy, fresh from a session in Parliament, and gave a very upbeat speech about how David Cameron's renegotiation was going to be a massive success. How time flies. So let's kick off. I mean, basically, this is a report about how others view global Britain. And we'll just go around maybe in the order in which I introduce you. So starting with David, and say, just on a sort of perusal of the report, what are the big takeaways for you about the ways in which people view global Britain and what opportunities global Britain might now enjoy?
Sure. So thank you for hosting us. And indeed, first of all, I need to say thanks again to the authors and Lizzie Allen, and indeed the fantastic team at UK in a Changing Europe. Yes, I will sit here and take all the credit for their work. What can I say? I just want to go through a couple of cross-cutting issues, perhaps, that it's interesting reading. It's a lovely, diverse report with a good range of countries. And so it's quite interesting sort of taking bits out of each and finding some commonalities, as it were. So the first thing I would say, it's quite interesting reflecting on the different types of strategies. So with India, we have a roadmap for 2030. With Uzbekistan in 2019, we had a partnership and cooperation agreement. With Nigeria, there's an economic development forum. There's also an inquiry in House of Parliament, in one of the foreign affairs committees, perhaps. In Central America, there's the UK Export Finance Partnership, and so on and so on. And so my first sort of prosaic point is, with all of this multifarious sorts of strategies, if that's the right phrase, just within, before we get to our friends abroad, it'd be interesting to work out or to reflect whether there is much opportunity for that kind of cross-pollination of ideas of what worked in South America. I mean, it's not about copying and pasting it to Central Asia or something like that, but ideas will work and not work, of course. And so that struck me as an interesting sort of small sort of opening gambit, as it were. Just briefly, secondly, the word I'm looking for is kind of equalness. I'm not really looking for equality. But a couple of things came out of the Nigeria and the India report, which was this slight vestige occasionally of what was described as maybe a loosely post-colonial or colonial mindset or something like that. Now, of course, this is a sentiment as much as anything, but I thought it is quite interesting in this kind of day and age that that sort of an idea was broached on two occasions, which makes me think, where else does that kind of a concern sit in the background? Potentially, we need to be careful, it would depend who the we is, I suppose, with the sort of Brexity triumphalist sentiment to some elements of British foreign policy, harking backwards, those sorts of ideas. Just a quick note there. Sorry? No, sorry, something came through. My apologies. But yeah, so that's the second thing in terms of equalness. Thirdly, this is issue of sort of opportunities for nimbleness, I think is what kind of came across to me. Obviously enough, we can't compete with the scale and the size of the EU, but the different countries brought out different sort of little aspects and little parts where, again, if we are sort of nimble enough, I think is the sentiment that came across, maybe we can take advantage. So the Brazilian report talked about the Brazilian relationship with the EU, some of the real issues there to do with commercial negotiations and the like, and maybe even as a link into Mercosur. And again, maybe there's room for sort of arbitrage there on the UK's part. But again, it strikes me as we would need to be nimble to sort of avail ourselves of those opportunities. The report looking at the GCC written by Sarah, it turned out to be quite prophetic, I think, in many ways. Sarah was talking about the importance of leveraging long-term relationships and the potential benefits that we might enjoy there. And indeed, just last week, we saw a $14 billion, I think it was, or potential up to $14 billion of an Emirati set of agreements of investments in the UK. First, as Sarah also sort of mentioned, one of the key areas that could be focused on, or was potential for focus, was looking at the health sort of sector, and that was indeed where we've seen some of the investment go to. And so that sort of almost is come around. Life is coming at us pretty fast these days, but that aspect holds up very nicely, I think. When it comes to India, again, there's this focus on health and the vaccine kind of technology and the vaccine procurement, production. Again, if we're nimble and quick, perhaps that can be leveraged going forwards. The Indian report also highlighted a significant gap in terms of the British engagement when it comes to defence, a long-term lacuna in many ways, which is conspicuous by its size, I suspect. When it comes to Japan and this comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, it just trips off the tongue, that the UK is sort of looking to engage in now. So this is, as we know, the third largest trading bloc in the world, 500 million people. Of course, it's not about some sort of replacement for the EU, needless to say. But again, I guess it's not about being nimble maybe, but engaging with that. The report made the interesting point, it never occurred to me, that given that this is a Japanese project, the British kind of engagement there might be really quite perceived as helping a Japanese initiative. What is for the Japanese a very important initiative is that, and a signal of kind of British kind of intent in that sense. The Mexican report brought up the issue that, things we need to keep abreast of in many ways. So with Mexico in the process of reorganizing its FTA with the EU, we need to be aware of, not just with Mexico, of course, but more generally, we need to be aware of what our European friends are doing and making sure that we don't lose kind of track in that sense, that there's not an obvious delta between the two where Britain would be at an advantage. And lastly, this idea of a litmus test kind of came up on one or two occasions. So my colleague Manos wrote the Central Asian chapter, and he mentioned that, it's an area that has not seen very much British engagement. There's been a fair amount of engagement in Kazakhstan, he was arguing, but not really Central Asia overall. And his point, and I do agree with it, is, well, here we are. If we are indeed global Britain, we need to be looking towards these new opportunities, as it were, these new areas. And maybe that's somewhere where we could focus. I would add that we've actually appointed a new trade commissioner quite recently to Central Asia and Eastern Europe, and whether they're having enough resources, but that's a positive sign. And those are just some quick thoughts. I'd be delighted to have a chat later, and we'll see where we go.
Thank you very much. My computer is dying. So, Gesine, I'm going to pass over to you, and I'm going to try and fix it.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you very much. After we now had quite a comprehensive overview already of the report and what are basically the main takeaways, I will maybe dive into the main takeaways for, however, a major European country and try to give a bit the European perspective. So first of all, what was very remarkable when you saw that concept of global Britain and the integrated review is actually that it opens many doors for cooperation with France, particularly, as France is the country which is, of course, after the US, mentioned very often in the report. And that it is already very clear that the UK and France will maintain their special relationship, which is often a very pragmatic relationship based on shared interests and also a set of shared values, also under global Britain. So that was actually good news for Paris. And when we are only looking purely at this report, I will come to more recent policy issues in a few moments, then we actually see that many doors are also opening up for new formats of cooperation. So first of all, what we basically see is that there is an important convergence of interests between France and the UK, which is generally something which is perceived as very positive in Paris, be it, for example, the Indo-Pacific, but also hybrid threats. So the general direction of this report rhymes pretty well with what policymakers prioritize in Paris. But what is actually the most interesting thing from a French perspective is that global Britain is actually pretty French. So when we are looking at this concept of global Britain, we see this idea of globally promoting values. We see that idea of being present, although the UK is, I think we can all agree on that, a middle power in the international system. And basically the UK and France share many characteristics, be it the GDP, be it population size, be it voting power in the United Nations. And now that the UK also has developed this narrative of being more present, it looks pretty much like France, because France in general has this vision and this approach of being generally very involved abroad, much more interventionist than the UK. But this idea of taking responsibility abroad and taking more responsibility abroad that is clearly formulated in the concept of global Britain rhymes pretty well with the French ambition. And also, when we're looking a bit into formats, the fact that the UK is more and more, or is very willing also to cooperate within ad hoc coalitions, as we see it, for instance, already in the Sahel, with the Task Force Takuba, or as we see it in the European Intervention Initiative, where the UK is also a member, shows basically that these formats, which were launched by Paris, and could therefore also be quite well negotiated with the UK, open a window of opportunity for having global Britain plus what might become global Europe. So I think an important takeaway overall from this report is that global Britain does not mean the UK alone, even though this report is not very pro-European. I mean, everything else would have surprised us in that context. But there are open doors for cooperation with France and for cooperation also with European partners, albeit not in the classical EU framework.
So you don't think the French door in particular has just been slammed rather noisily shut then?
That is exactly the point I wanted to come to now, because I mean, what all looks quite rosy and quite nice in what I'm saying here looks a bit, or what the paper says particularly, looks a bit different in the news that we've had from the last days, you know, the AUKUS deal between Australia, the US, and the UK. Although France had already had a submarine deal with Australia, this kind of political choice, let's put it like that, is for France. The French foreign minister called it a step in the back. And that is definitely the case, because the relationship between the UK and France has generally been very pragmatic, driven by joint shared interests. And now the fact that the UK, alongside with the US, prioritizes its own interests, and it is not clear in how far France was consulted. And in any case, it's clear that France is, for the moment, excluded from AUKUS. That does not only significantly impact the trust between France and the UK, but definitely also the appetite for cooperation with this partner. And also, or this is even more frustrating in the eyes, or from a French perspective, that the Indo-Pacific is definitely the next theater, or the big theater in the years to come for international affairs, where the UK and France could have cooperated, also, or particularly in terms of maritime security. But after what happened with AUKUS, there might be a lot of confidence building and a lot of diplomatic initiatives necessary to get back to a point where cooperation can actually be effective.
Okay. David, actually, before I turn to you, David, let me say, apologies for all those echoes and weirdness. I've swapped computer because my other computer seemed to be going mad. So I hope that the sound and the video is all right now. And do stick your questions on Slido, and I hope we can resume service as normal. But David, you were in government an awful long time, and you've seen an awful lot while in government. But have you ever seen anything like the events of the last week?
I'm trying to think of a comparable example. I suppose some of President Trump's comments about NATO caused considerable furore. In terms of fierce rows, public rows within the Western alliance, I mean, take out Trump, and it's quite hard to think of anything quite like this in recent years. But I think we've got to remember that both Emmanuel Macron and Scott Morrison have got elections coming up next year when they both face pretty tough battles to try and get re-elected. So some of this is electoral, but I think my view on this is that since the Australians clearly took a decision that they no longer believe that the French contract would deliver what they needed for their security needs, it's quite hard to see the British government being phoned up by the Australians saying, well, oh, no, please go away, we can't help you, you must stick with Paris. And it's certainly not how a French minister would have reacted if he'd got a call of that nature. But I think the handling probably by Washington does seem to have been clumsy, and that clearly work needs to take place to try to put things together, because you look at underlying common interests, and there's no way that you will get an effective European pillar of the Atlantic Alliance without both the UK and France being centrally involved in some way, because we're the only two European countries that have both got the significant military, intelligence and diplomatic assets to make it work, but combine that with the political will to actually use those, and in a way that Germany, for obvious historical reasons, is deeply reluctant to do even now. So we have to find ways, London, Paris, of working more effectively together. And if the European allies are to have any greater flexibility to act without the Americans, because there'll be occasions, Africa perhaps, where the Americans don't want to act in the future, but where Britain and France do, then we have to have systems in place to enable us to do that. So we have to rebuild on this, but it's going through a bumpy patch at the moment.
Is there not a danger? I mean, you spoke about the European pillar of NATO, and this is for you as well, Gesine, I suppose, that what has just happened reignites traditional French distrust of NATO. I mean, you've heard some of the early rhetoric, which is very striking. I mean, there were moments when it felt a bit like we were in 1966 all over again. But is there a danger that actually this will be grist to the mill for those in Paris who actually think this isn't about a European pillar of NATO, this is about Europeans doing things separately to NATO? Do you think that? Go ahead, David.
There'll be some of that, certainly. And those who believe that will try to exploit this difference. I don't myself believe that's what President Macron is after. I mean, my understanding of President Macron, having heard him speak on this, having read his thoughts, is that he wants there to be a revived, reformed NATO, but he wants that complemented by what I describe as a European capability to act. and the systems, mechanisms in international agreements in place for that to happen, so that not everything has to be done on the say-so of Washington. And I think that there is sufficient common ground between that approach and that of any UK government to make it possible for us to find a new way forward. But look at the rest of Europe. The very last thing that the Baltic states or Poland or Romania or other EU members want is to see any weakening of NATO or duplication of NATO's functions by the European Union. So I don't think there is an alternative to NATO as the fundamentals of our collective security, but then there is scope, I think, for a sensible discussion about how the European democracies can work more effectively together, because I think Biden is very clear that he's going to focus on what he sees as absolutely core US national interests, predominantly in the Indo-Pacific, but clearly the relationship with Russia. I think Israel-Iran is going to be important for him still. But there'll be things happening, I suspect, in the Western Balkans, in Africa, in Eastern Europe, that will matter a lot to European countries, but which the US will see as rather peripheral. And as Obama said to Cameron and Sarkozy over Libya, look, I'll give you support, but you guys have got to own this. You've got to take the political leadership.
Gesine, would you agree with that?
I would go a bit further. So in general, I would agree, like, you won't have or at least on the government level, you won't have the debate of France leaving NATO. So that is probably the good news about that, because I mean, France in general has a tradition, or a strategic culture rather, that focuses much more on integrating European security through the EU and not through NATO. And in that context, you have to be aware that basically Macron is as transatlantic as it gets in France. So only if he is critical or says things